going to bring up my chairperson and our opening presenter. Kelly McKee is a Recruitment, Retention, and Innovation Team Lead with Global Trial Optimization at Merck. She's been a part of this conference for many years, and you've seen her do presentations, run panels. She's very good at what she does both at work and also as a person to have kind of leading a conversation. So I'm grateful to you, Kelly, for being here and for doing this. So everybody, please welcome Kelly McKee.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. Welcome to Scope. This conference is always so exciting for me as we gather clinical trial operations experts together to exchange information, share case studies, and talk about visions for improving our space. And while the vast majority of us work far more than 40 hours a week, are connected to our laptops and smartphones 24/7, and really never stop thinking of our day jobs, how many of us can honestly say that we are helping to promote clinical trial awareness and really get the word out on the importance of clinical trials to the future of medicine? Now let's face it, our industry does not have a good reputation. One only has to listen to a political debate, news broadcast, or read a headline to see that pharma is not held in high regard. In fact, it's a pretty dirty word. Mention clinical trials and you'll either get a blank stare, a mention of a historical horror story, or the term guinea pig. And the media certainly doesn't help us. They are quick to headline the bad. But what about all the good? What about the fact that in oncology, the advances of immunotherapy are giving hope to so many, including past US presidents? What about the thousands of people who are now hepatitis C free in a matter of weeks? These advances, and they're awesome, were brought to us by clinical trials, by the women and men who volunteered to participate in our studies, by the physicians, nurses, and study coordinators who engaged these patients, explained the opportunities and risks involved with clinical trials, and allowed us to collect data that gets the great scientific creations approved and available to help humanity. And we've all heard the statistics. Only 3 to 5% of individuals with cancer participate in clinical trials. Only 10% of studies meet their accrual timelines. These numbers are terrible. So what can we do about that? Do we wait for our organizations to launch a campaign? Do we hire a celebrity to make clinical trials cool? Or do we hunker down and just keep working, study by study, program by program, hoping that sometime, somewhere, things will get better? Or do we realize that we are empowered to make a difference, that we have the power in our own social spheres to talk about clinical trials and to raise awareness, to listen to patients, to understand what they want in their therapies, what's it like to live with their diseases and conditions, and to learn what it's like from their perspective to be in or to consider to be in one of our clinical trials? One of my favorite quotes comes from Margaret Mead, who said, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens cannot change the world. In fact, it's the only thing that ever has." So let's become that group, right here, right now. In fact, it's my Scope 2016 challenge to all of you. Now, I'm very excited to introduce you to one of those thoughtful, committed citizens, Ken Getz, who will speak to us about ROI expectations and objectives for optimized patient awareness and engagement.
So I have 3 main objectives this morning with my presentation. The first is that I want to actually share with you insights that we're learning from organizations that are now implementing patient-centric initiatives. The second is that I want to talk about 2 ongoing developments to gather more data so that we can quantify the impact of these metrics, of these patient-centric initiatives going forward, and we can have metrics that truly help us understand the business case for a patient-centric approach. And I know for many of you that's hard to fathom. We know that there's a moral imperative to do this. It's the right thing to do. But senior management and those in your organizations who are really focusing on the bottom line are also looking at the business case to justify our investments in this area. And the third piece is to really ask you to join in sharing your business cases, your experiences, so that we can create a library and share those insights with you going forward. In 2012, the Tufts Center conducted a survey of about 100 clinical ops executives. And we asked some very simple questions, not easy to answer, but just to do a scan of their organizations and to report on whether they believe they're in the piloting or executing stage of patient-centric initiatives, whether they're planning to implement them, or whether they have no plans whatsoever. And we conducted a follow-up survey 3 years later, and these are the results, and they surprised us greatly. Given all of the momentum, all of the focus on patient centricity today, in fact, to the point where some are even getting tired of all of the buzz and all of the focus now around it, we saw very, very little change in the percentage of organizations that are piloting or executing these initiatives. And in fact, some of the organizations that were in the piloting and executing group in the earlier study were now in the planning group in the later study. And as you can see, we still saw a very high percentage that fell in the no planning group. And this really surprised us, in part because we expected to see more hands-on focus on this particular area, because there's such widespread support for this approach to really transform the drug development process. So what's really holding us back? And I think many of you have very, very direct experiences here. In the same survey, we asked each of these executives to tell us what some of the primary factors were, and the number one area was a catch-all, a lack of internal resistance. And that related in many cases to the legal or regulatory affairs constraints, but also related to operating processes, many of them legacy or long-established processes that could not be altered to really accommodate the patient-centric approach without really affecting timelines, raising the level of risk in the program. That second area that many pointed to was that they just lacked the internal expertise to implement, to absorb, and to accommodate many of these new approaches. And about a third talked about really the lack of funding, that most of the investment here really was unplanned and unbudgeted, and as a result, they really had to find the dollars from other places and allocate them for piloted initiatives. The other thing we did is we asked, with open-ended questions, if we could get these executives to really talk about the situation itself and what was really going on. And what we heard is very consistent with, I think, what many of you are experiencing, that there's very, very widespread and strong belief in the importance of a patient-centric approach to drug development, but there's a lot of confusion about how to define it, a lot of confusion and concern about what structures, what mechanisms need to be put in place to actually manage and develop plans and to coordinate the implementation of many of these processes. And there's also concern that there are so many cooks that are driving this process. And that notion of there being so many organizations involved is a very positive development as well, because it really suggests that we have the entire enterprise mobilized to affect drug development activity with more of a patient-centric approach. But we need to make sense out of all of this activity. And that's what I wanted to suggest here. We really have three broad groups of organizations that are each touching different areas of this movement. We have regulatory agencies, and many of you may know that much of that focus has been on amplifying the patient voice, particularly rare diseases, to really listen to patient-defined endpoints and outcome measures, and to try to use that voice to help set the stage for future development programs. The FDA and EMA are also providing guidelines on what are acceptable practices where we can accommodate patient-centric approaches. And in a moment, I'll show you some of the primary approaches that we see implemented today. We see a whole collection of organizations that I put into the quasi-regulatory bucket. CITI, PCORI, MRCT, the Institute of Medicine, Transcelerate, UPATI. These are all organizations that are taking their lead to some extent by the momentum that has been created by regulatory agencies to essentially offer frameworks that we can use to think about where patient-centric initiatives can best be adapted to our processes moving forward. And if you haven't seen any of these frameworks, it's really worth taking a look to get some insight into how we can think about them as a continuum of initiatives to enhance patient experience in clinical research, to really accommodate their input into the design of our studies, to really measure and improve their satisfaction in our studies going forward. Most of the heavy weight and the heavy lifting, however, rests with the clinical operations function. That is where the patient-centric initiatives have to be adopted, have to be integrated into your existing processes. And it's at the individual company level where we see focus on select initiatives that will play a role in various points along the continuum of study conduct, and I'll show you those in a minute. Every organization is approaching this differently, and we have not seen a lot of communication to really share some of the management mechanisms that have been put into place. Some organizations have created a chief patient officer, typically a medical professional who is now overseeing a lot of the patient-centric initiatives and is almost the external-facing party within the organization. Others have really pushed the management of patient-centric initiatives to the clinical teams themselves. Very few organizations are actually measuring the impact that any of these early-stage piloted initiatives are having. And of course, a number of organizations are partnering or collaborating with other organizations, with technology solutions providers, to improve their ability to access and amplify input from the patient and the clinical care community. This is a very long list, I apologize that this slide is so dense, but it really highlights a lot of the initiatives that companies are examining or are piloting and executing. Many of the organizations that are farther along have already created an engagement policy manual that really provides some principles for the organization to follow. And a number of organizations have created workshops or meetings where they can raise awareness within their own organizations to really show how committed the organization is to supporting a patient-centric approach. And then you see many others here, some that are internal governance approaches to evaluating the feasibility of protocol design, with a primary goal, in fact, to reduce the number of amendments and to really try to enhance the experience of the volunteer and to improve the executional feasibility of the study. The use of patient advisory boards to provide input into protocol design, really tapping into a patient input to challenge the schedule of assessments and to really take a hard look at what the experience of participation may be like through the eyes of the patient or the investigative site. Many others here. The use of wearable devices is another convenience mechanism that a number of organizations are considering or are now using. Home nursing networks is another important initiative where the goal is to actually bring the trial to the patient's workplace or to their home, and as another way of boosting convenience. The return of lay language clinical trial results summaries is another growing initiative, and that's part of the effort to create closure and to convey value to the study volunteer. Every one of these initiatives is essentially supporting 4 core engagement objectives. Many of them enhance the relevance of the study so that we're now conducting research where we can really create focus on endpoints and the experience of the volunteer as a way of really cutting out a lot of the noise, a lot of the complexity, and really focusing on those areas that we believe matter most and should be central to our design. They're intended to improve the feasibility of our studies, and convenience is a part of that. And ultimately, if we do it right, we create a level of ownership among the patient community as well as the clinical care, the healthcare provider community, to really support the success of our research because of its relevance and focus as defined by the patient community and their support network. Well, there's another consideration that wasn't articulated well when we surveyed clinical operations executives, but it really came through very clearly in this question that we measured. We asked them to tell us or to rank the level of senior management support for the implementation of patient-centric initiatives in their organizations. And we saw a very strong relationship. Not surprising, but essentially those companies that were farther along had far greater senior management support. And you can see that here. Those companies that really were not planning to implement any initiatives soon, those were the ones that rarely reported that senior management appeared to be very committed or actively involved. Those that were in the planning stages, you started to see that very committed rating, and the moderately committed or active group also rise. And then the piloting and executing group, you saw very, very strong commitment. And of course, senior management is really looking for us to spell out the business case. We all know that a patient-centric approach, to Kelly's point, is the right thing to do, but that moral imperative alone is not enough to build the momentum and to really create sustainable patient-centric activity. And there are really two parallel tracks here that we need to think about, and the Tufts Center is really focusing on both of them in collaboration with other groups. The first is to really establish a value proposition for a patient-centric approach. It's really a change in our thinking, but we've reached that point where we need to put some metrics and to quantify impact in our experiences so that we can make strong and educated business decisions about which initiatives will be the ones to really invest in and to integrate into our routine and standard activity. The value proposition approach is prospective in nature. It will look to model, based on agreed upon benchmarks, the future impact of a collective of initiatives on program level factors like success rates and cycle time, and even the portfolio level. And we can see and will see some very, very strong impact that we can quantify there, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. This is an initiative that the Tufts Center started with Citi last year, and we're at the point where we're nearly ready to actually run the value proposition model, and we'll be publishing the results. And I'll show you where I think you're going to see a lot of the impact. The return on engagement area is more of a retrospective look, and here we are interested in collecting historical data on recently implemented programs, either case studies or actual experience that we can then aggregate and present back to you that will really reflect study-level impact of many of these initiatives. And this is another program that was started with the Tufts Center and the DIA and its community. We have about 21 companies now that are all participating in that initiative, and we're looking for more to share their case studies. So if we look at the value proposition area, there are really two primary dimensions, and these are just examples. There are many others, but what we're looking to do is to start to map those specific initiatives that offer the highest benefit, relative benefit to the patient, and also are perceived by sponsor companies to provide a benefit to them, and also we're trying to measure the level of investment required. And it's that upper left-hand quadrant that is the most attractive intersection of these two dimensions, where we're going to look at very high level of benefit and minimal investment, but we'll work our way across that top area as well, the high benefit, high investment arena, to try to measure and quantify the value proposition. If we do it right, we will be able to actually demonstrate some very, very large impact areas. You may recall that last year we released a report measuring the total capitalized cost to develop a single successful drug. That's now up at about $2.6 billion, and that's capitalized over the life of the drug. The model will be able to show us, based on impact on cycle time, success rates, or the economics of an individual development program, what impact we can actually expect. And what we hope to show is that even modest and incremental improvements in success rates will literally contribute several $100 million in savings. Being able to release a larger percentage of drugs into the market sooner through improvements in cycle time, will be able to offer us substantial improvements in program level costs when they're measured over a capitalized cost level. So that's really the value proposition. If we move now to look at the return on engagement investment, this is a tricky area because we are now looking at retrospective data, and very few organizations are measuring that. So we really have to agree on a set of short-term measures that we can begin to gather now, and those would typically be what we would call reach or prevalence measures. How many patient-centric initiatives are being implemented, in what primary areas, how many patients have been reached, how many sites have been involved, or how many patients have been involved. The longer-term objectives or variables would be, in fact, more of the performance measures. And we need to, for case study analysis and for a retrospective assessment, we need to have a pre and post measures so we can actually have a baseline that we're comparing our case studies or any of our aggregate measures to. There are a variety of dependent variables that we are looking to measure through many of the case studies that we're doing in this retrospective return on engagement analysis. So I mentioned prevalence and reach variables. Those are short-term in nature and relatively easy for companies to gather when they map a lot of the initiatives that they're implementing. Satisfaction variables take more effort, but that's really going to your study volunteers or your investigative sites and looking at measuring impact on work burden, measuring impact on the patient's experiences and expectations, and satisfaction in the study. And the performance variables are those where we're really ultimately looking at measuring cycle time changes, changes in the study budget, et cetera. If you want to get a good feeling for how all these variables interact, I've just listed a paper that was published last year that sort of shows the framework and even relates them to the value proposition itself. Because at the end of the day, we want to combine those two measures so we have a true picture of return on engagement, investment in the short term, and what at the program level impact we can expect. So I mentioned the Tufts Center DIA initiative. We have now 21 participating sponsor and CRO companies. We're looking to actually release the very first case examples in June of this year, and I really encourage those of you who are interested to send me a note, and I'm happy to share a lot of the metrics with you going forward. There are 4 primary areas of focus in this specific working group. One is specifically on gathering the case examples and documenting return on engagement investment. The second is on mapping various initiatives that organizations are supporting, but also getting some of the companies to look at what the commercial side is doing. Because in many organizations, commercial has actually been more heavily involved in patient engagement initiatives for some time. And they have gathered, in some cases, many more metrics to quantify and justify their investment in these areas than we realize. In fact, we found 2 organizations where we have a 10-year history of really strong return based on their work with patient advocacy groups. And we hope to document all of this and share it with you so that you can work with your senior management to really reach a level of strong support that from the senior ranks. 2 other areas we're looking at trying to map out and articulate a variety of internal structures and mechanisms that organizations are supporting and sharing those insights. Some of the challenges and some of the ideas that have been implemented and tested and then modified over time. As I mentioned, some of these mechanisms are centralized structures, others are more decentralized, and really looking at what processes they're following, what they're measuring, what they're overseeing, and how they interact with the various clinical functions. And then we also have one group looking at the variety of those quasi-regulatory groups that have now created a set of frameworks as well as regulatory guidelines to see where there are gaps and conflicts so that we can identify places where industry can actually assert input and help shape those frameworks and guidelines going forward. So just to wet your whistle, I've just got a couple of case examples that I'll share with you as we build our library. And this is the point where I really want to, again, solicit your support. If you are aware of a program in your company or an initiative in your company and you'd like to share a de-identified case example, please speak with us as we look to map these. We're collecting a couple of very strong examples in the impact of patient advocacy, collaborations with and partnerships with sponsor companies, two that we have documented well, one with cystic fibrosis and Friedreich ataxia, and these have both demonstrated faster development times and cost savings largely through funds that were raised by patient communities to support the development enterprise and their ability to influence their own community to participate in these studies. That have real ownership in the success of the programs. E-consent is an area where there's a lot of data now, and what we're largely seeing as we aggregate these case examples is that we're only seeing modest incremental improvement in patient comprehension through use of these tools, but we're seeing more measurable improvement in retention levels, and we hope to document that with quantified impact on those retention rates. Feasibility review committees, we already have a number of organizations, a high percentage, 2/3 of 63 companies that have participated in providing these case examples are now reporting a reduction in the number of protocol amendments. Half are telling us that they are already measuring a reduction in the investigative site work effort to administer these protocols, et cetera. Patient advocacy panels, we now have about 12 case examples where we're actually starting to document some of the changes that are coming as a result of these advisory panels or boards, including changes to a small number of changes to the actual schedule of visits on average per panel, 4 changes to the informed consent form, and a number of changes to a lot of the communication material. And we hope ultimately to move beyond measurement of those impact areas to actually quantify what impact that might have had on improving patient satisfaction, accelerating study conduct cycle time. The mobile nursing environment, there are now a number of case examples with some quantified impact measures. Many of these specific studies are reporting an increase in volunteer adherence rates and also reduction in the work burden for the investigative site staff as it's moving into the patient's home through the use of a new resource. And then, as I mentioned, on the commercial side, we're seeing a lot of input there, much of it related to the use of patient advocacy groups and what impact they're having even on post-marketing or phase 4 studies, as well as on providing feedback or input back into development planning. So lots of case examples that we're trying to build, and again, if you're interested in learning more about these studies or even sharing some of your case studies with us, our hope is to actually document them and publish as well as present them to the broader clinical operations community. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to the phase 2 of our plenary program. And again, I just want to thank you all for the privilege of being able to present this information.